Hi everyone and welcome. What you see here is a photograph of some notes that I took a couple weeks ago. I was going to use this illustration here to lead into a discussion in one of my videos recently talking about my outdoor worm system, what had been done to take the material out of it and screen it and to process it and to separate the materials and where things stood. But this illustration has got to be a couple weeks old at this point. The board has just been sitting on my desk. It was never used in any videos, and you can even see it's got all kinds of scratches and bumps, and I haven't been taking a great deal of care to not touch the screen. I've been resting things on it, and every time you touch that screen, it marks the drawing. So I wanted to take a quick photograph of this because it was a pretty good outline of what I wanted to talk about, but it was already so far behind that I wanted to redo the drawing. So what you see here is my revised version of the illustration. It pretty much recounts most of the elements of the original drawing, showing how the worm bag that was outside, which had gone for a full 332 days, had been harvested in such a way that I had screened the materials, resulting in a collection of large chunk materials as well as the worms, everything that got caught in the screen, as well as everything that passed through the screen, which was a collection of the castings, as well as what I assume to be a good number of the cocoons left behind by the worms. So now, I guess the stuff that I've added is the reference to how long ago this has occurred. Now it's been 27 days, so it's been almost 4 weeks since I did this. And over that time, over those 27 days, the I guess number one, the cocoons sitting in all those castings have just been pretty much sitting there. And we've checked in on it on a couple occasions. I've even thrown some food in there. Just threw some leaves into the middle of the bin, I think on a couple occasions, just to make sure that if there's worms hanging around in that material that they've got an ample supply of food to chew on. And what became of the large chunk materials and the worms was that I, within a couple days, I believe, within about maybe 4 or 5 days, I believe, I came back into this system, and then I did what is known as light separation, to sort of use bright lights to make the worms dive down into the material, allowing me to skim the material off the top, resulting in a collection of the large chunk material on one side, as well as the worms on the other side. And for the past, I don't know how you want to count it, 27 days, 22 days, whatever, if it was really, I think it was 5 days, that the material sat together until I separated them. And I believe it's been 22 days now since the worms were pulled out of that old material that they inhabited, and they were positioned into a temporary holding bin where they're kind of coexisting with what's written over here. It's BSF. So I did observe that the worms were living with some black soldier flies, and since I'm intending to take these worms down into my basement at some point in the future, I just wanted to allow those black soldier fly larvae to evolve, grow to the point where they transform into a fly and just exit the bin on their own. And then at some point soon I'll feel like I've really just got a collection of worms here, and then I'll feel comfortable about bringing those inside. So you'll see over here, this sort of tracks back to this concept of just giving it time. The time also applies to the cocoons in the castings, because over time those cocoons will hatch and there'll be baby worms, and the baby worms will hopefully grow to the point where they kind of get mobile and start cruising around within the material. And then the idea there is to be able to sort of collect all those worms together, and then also put them back together with their family into whatever worm bin it is that gets established using these worms down in my wormery. So that leaves us with a couple loose ends, right? Number one, we've got an empty bag sitting outside just doing nothing. And we've even got some large, heavily broken down materials that were separated from the worms, which still need some composting. So it seemed like an opportune time to get back into having an outdoor worm bag. So what I wanted to do today was revisit my outdoor compost barrel, which is where I usually source worms whenever I want to populate a new outdoor worm bag. And I've also done a few things outside to sort of prep for the job. So I figured I'd start in here, give a quick overview of what my game plan is, and then we could proceed out to the garden. So why don't we do that now? So what we have here is the bag, the vacated bag that was emptied out 27 days ago, as well as some of the things that we talked about earlier, such as the large particle matter that got caught in the screen, the stuff that we're going to put right back into service to let it continue breaking down, because there's a lot of particles in here that never broke down, peanut shells, little stick stems. I figured let's put it all back into service. And then I thought, well, you know, instead of just throwing in the old stuff, let's throw in a little bit of new stuff as well to mix in with it. So I've got a variety of different types of fresh bedding to include, some chopped up paper towel and toilet paper tubes, just cardboard basically, as well as some fresh leaves. And I've even got my little container of crushed eggshells down here so that I could throw in some grit, make sure that the worms have what they need to break down the food that they're eating. I don't know how dry or wet this stuff is, but I've got my watering can just in case I feel like I've got to add a little bit of moisture. In my previous rendition of this, the bag originally sat down on the ground and then it started getting invaded. So I had moles or shrews or some sort of creature burrowing through the material, gobbling up all the worms, pretty much decimating the population in here, almost driving me to the point where I was going to just quit the whole endeavor and forget having an outdoor worm bag. But with the encouragement of the viewers, I kind of got the system back on its feet. But to protect it from invaders, I decided I was going to take a pot. In the previous version, I was using this pot before it broke like this. The pot was inverted, placed within this old trash pail, and then on top of the pot rested this piece of plywood, and then on top of that was the bag, elevating it off the ground just high enough to prevent any sort of invaders from accessing the contents, and also kind of getting it up a little bit higher to make it easier for me to access. So now, since that pot is all broken up and not really usable in that way anymore, I've got a substitute pot standing by, all ready to go. And I even created a new platform for this, since I've already kind of adopted the use of this old one in my compost barrel. So we'll be back to the compost barrel later to fetch worms, and for that purpose I've got my little collection tub here as well as a glove. But we're going to set up the place to put the worms first, get that out of the way, and then we'll get to the fun stuff, getting our volunteers out of the compost barrel. So the only other thing I didn't really mention was the bag over here. This is a brand new bag as opposed to the old bag, which actually you can see that it's a double bag setup. I found that the double bag holds on to moisture a lot better than a single bag, so I'm going back to the double bag configuration. And as you can see, there's a significant size difference. So I have the option to go with new bags, but they're smaller. So I'm going back with the old bags. So let's get to work on setting up this bin. So now when it comes to building a worm bin, there's not a whole lot to it. You use your bedding of choice, paper, cardboard, cow manure, or leaves, whatever it is that you have on hand. In my case, I've got leaves, I've got cardboard. So I thought that this would make a pretty good foundational layer to put down on the bottom of my container. I kind of thought that these little tubes, whether they're resting on their side or if they stand up upright, they kind of add to the structure a little bit, I thought. And I had a whole bunch of them laying around too, so it's about time I started doing away with them. So that's my first layer, and then I saved a little bit of leafy material to throw in on the top. But what we've got remaining now is a whole bunch of this stuff that I mentioned earlier. It's the stuff that the worms used to reside in, the stuff that did not get broken down. And you can see it's a lot of really tough stuff. Who knows how long it's going to take. So back in with it. I debated using this stuff, but I also figured that, you know what, there's probably a whole bunch of worms in here as well as a whole bunch of baby worms, and I was right. When I looked down in there, I could see little baby worms squirming around, or at least there's one right there in the middle. There's another worm right there, and you know, I wasn't very thorough going through this stuff. In fact, I tried to do it as quickly as I could since I wanted to minimize the trauma on the worms that were inhabiting this stuff. So I did a fairly quick light separation, but it was my guess that there was probably a good number of not only worms but cocoons caught up in this material. So I thought that it would make good sense to put the whole thing right back into service as is, And as you can see, not sure how good the lighting is in here, but there's even more worms on the bottom. So I'll have to scoop those little guys out as well, but I've got the remainder of this stuff that's also in the second pot here. So it's all the same stuff, just that the stuff on the very tippy top is a little bit drier from sitting out here for the past 4 weeks. But luckily it's to a large degree castings, and the castings are got a nice moisture. They got that incredible ability to, you know, retain moisture. Wow, look at that. Way many more worms in here than I expected. So it looks like this bin is going to be off to a pretty good start, even without bringing in recruits from the compost barrel. It almost makes me wonder if we should just see if launching this system off just the way it is would be possible. I had no idea there were this many worms still hanging out inside this material. I thought that as a result of the light separation, I had managed to round up the majority of them, but like I said earlier, I was trying to burn through that process pretty rapidly to get it done, and it does appear that in doing so, I did end up leaving a very good number of worms remaining in that material. So I could always come back to this and try to make sure I'm not leaving any wormies behind in these pots. Perhaps give the whole thing a rinse. And you know, when I look at the moisture content, especially of the stuff that was at the very bottom, it's even a lot more damp than I expected it to be. I did position this material in a place where it was sheltered from rain, so even though it's been sitting out here for a number of weeks, it was not exposed to the rainfall or anything like that. I did cover it up to try to limit the evaporation and the drying of the material. So it might not even be necessary to add moisture to this stuff. I might be able to just leave it as is. So I bought over the watering can just in case, but I'm starting to get the sense that it's unnecessary. I'm sure that the dry cardboard and leaves at the bottom will start absorbing some of the moisture from this stuff and maybe dry it out a little bit. I guess if need be, at some point in the future, we can go ahead and add moisture, either through juicy, moist foods or even straight water. But the fact that it sits out here exposed to the air, it also gets rained on too. So I don't think adding moisture at this point would be necessary, so I'm not going to do that. So now before we cover up with the leaves here, I've got my crushed eggshell, and I'm just going to go ahead and apply the grit. Now just a word of warning, if you're handling crushed eggshell as I am here, I'm in a pretty well ventilated place and it's pretty much blowing the dust of this stuff away from me, away from my face, which makes it a little bit more safe than if it was just flying up in my face, allowing me to breathe this stuff in. You do not want to breathe this stuff in. It's extremely coarse, and if it gets in your lungs, it can cause damage. So be warned, don't do that. I do feel like in the environment that we have here, it was probably safe for me to do it the way I did. So do as I say, not as I do. I don't know what these are. These look like little beetles or something, or whatever they may be. They were kind of clinging onto the walls of the container. I figured I would peel them off because I keep noticing them, but I've never really taken a very close look at what the heck they were. So I held on to a little bit of leafy material that I wanted to cover up this top surface with, and that pretty much concludes the build of the bin. So the only thing remaining is to put it into its container over here. So all I got to do is plop in the pot, throw on the plywood for it to rest on top of, and throw the bag in there, and we're going to be good to go. And just like that, we're all set for the worms. And it's kind of cool that we've already got worms in there already. I knew that there'd be some, but I didn't really expect there to be that many. So now that leads us to the spot where we're going to recruit more worms from, which is my compost barrel. So let's get to that, and we'll be done in a jiffy. So I've got these two pots here. I did rinse them out, and I didn't really see any more worms in them, but they're pretty clean. So I'm going to need these because I need to remove a certain amount of material off the top of this set up here to get access to the lower levels where I expect the worms to be. This is just my everyday compost barrel, so every time I pull weeds, every time I prune my plants in my garden, every time I've got kitchen scraps that need to be discarded, compostable kitchen scraps, they all end up out here for the most part, unless I've set them aside to be used in my wormery. And as you can see, I did a pretty big job pruning my tomatoes the other day. So I've got a whole bunch of material here that needs to be pulled out to get it out of our way so we can get down into the spots where hopefully we'll find some worms. So let's see what we could do about pulling some of this stuff out of here. You can see I had put a cantaloupe in here, and over here you can already see some of these larvae. See these larvae buzzing around over here? This little tiny one over here by my index finger. There was even a smaller one over here somewhere. There's a whole bunch of black soldier fly larvae ripping around inside this system. And if you've ever used black soldier flies to compost stuff, then you'll know that these little guys are ravenous. They'll break down just about anything, and they'll do it fast. So we will probably encounter little pockets of black soldier fly larvae here and there. And whenever I set one of these outdoor systems up, I do kind of consider black soldier flies as sort of just something that's going to end up tagging along with the worms when I recruit worms out of a system like this, as well as a bunch of other things too, you know. I mean, this is kind of an anything goes environment, you know, so besides worms hanging out in here, there's all kinds of other creatures that have made their way in here on their own. See a couple pill bugs over here. In this case, the black soldier fly larvae are really dark in color, and this is what they look like when they stop eating and they go dormant and they start preparing to pupate and turn into a fly. We're going to have to make a little bit more room in here for ourselves and start scooping out the remainder of these pruned tomato leaves. All stuff that's going to go right back in when we're done. And now we're actually getting down into the layer of stuff that that was largely the stuff that was in my freezer, set aside as worm food, but then my freezer was left open. Anybody who's a regular on my channel is probably getting tired of hearing the story. But I got back from vacation a few days ago, and to my surprise, the freezer door was left open, and a whole bunch of stuff, including all the worm food and, you know, all the human food, had thawed out. And I tried to salvage some of the worm food and put it aside for future worm bin feedings, but a lot of this stuff just ended up out here because a lot of it just turned to mush. I'm going to see how much of this I could fit into this pot just to get it out of our way, make it a little easier to access the contents of this bin. Then we could start trying to find little pockets of material that are loaded with worms. And I usually fill up that little plastic container I showed you earlier with worms, and I usually assume that by doing so I'm collecting something in the neighborhood of 500 to 1,000 worms, depending on how, you know, densely populated each handful of material is that I pull out. So I'm kind of running out of room here. I pretty much topped off my little collection pail here, and I guess they're going to need to get rinsed one more time before we could put them away. So this is my collection thing that I was talking about earlier, and every now and then I see worms, a whole bunch of them, but then they just scuttle out of view and vanish. I can always see a whole bunch of black soldier fly larvae hanging out too. You can see the material that they leave behind. Really nice, dark, rich compost everywhere. The way I understand it is that the black soldier fly larvae, I guess they eat so quickly that a lot of the nourishing value of the food that they're consuming doesn't really get absorbed by their bodies, although a large portion of it does to stimulate their very rapid growth. But they're what do they call it? There's a specific name for the same way worms have vermicompost or castings as their poop. frass. So when an insect poops, as in the case with the black soldier fly or their larvae, it's referred to as frass. And the frass is apparently something that the worms can consume. So it's sort of like a teamwork scenario where the black soldier flies attack the food, gobble up a large portion of it, and what they leave behind as far as their solid waste is all stuff that can be utilized by the worms. So they're kind of doing the 1-2 punch on breaking down the materials that I throw in here. As you can see, every time I turn around a chunk of material, there's just a whole bunch of worms hanging out in it. And the way I see it is that if there's black soldier fly larvae mixed in with the worms, they'll go over into the new outdoor worm bag with the worms, and within a couple weeks, depending on how big the larvae are when I collect them, they'll just transform into a fly and then exit the bin on their own, and then I'll be left with just worms. So it's all good in the end. And I guess the only trick part is that you have to sort of get over the disgust level. I remember the first time I started trying to pick out worms from my compost barrel. Actually, I wasn't even going after worms. I thought that I'd be able to get some good partially broken down materials, thinking that it was just sort of a natural or kind of microbial breakdown process happening in a system like this. And when I started scooping out some of these partially broken down chunks of food, they were covered in these larvae, and that's kind of when I discovered black soldier flies and their larvae. And I started doing some research on it and how good they are at composting, and ever since then they've kind of been a welcome guest in my compost barrels, because it is quite incredible to see how they break stuff down. If you're a regular on my channel, we've been in this bin together before. You've seen me rummaging through this bin looking for worms, like last year when I had to repopulate my bag after it got raided and decimated. And this container has never been emptied, at least not in a couple years now. I don't remember the last time I emptied it. So the stuff just keeps getting broken down. I mean, at some point it's got to reach capacity. I don't know how long that's going to take, but it does seem like I've always got room in here. A lot of times I'll, get a whole bunch of cuttings from the garden, throw them in here, pretty much fill the barrel up to the rim. And I call it a barrel, but it's just a trash pail, basically. I fill the whole thing up to the rim, and then between the worms working it down, the black soldier fly larvae working it down, the level just keeps dropping every time. It's really quite impressive. And unfortunately, the black soldier flies are only useful to me as composters in my barrel here during the warmer months, because they can only live in warmer conditions, and as soon as the temperatures start dropping, that pretty much brings about the end of the black soldier fly larvae. And then I believe they just sort of go into sort of a dormant state. While the worms can usually handle being out here all winter, and they do, because that's what I do, is I just leave my bag out here all winter, and the worms do okay. But the black soldier fly larvae pretty much screech to a halt, stop composting, and it kind of makes me wonder. I think that what happens is that the larvae do go dormant, and then once the weather becomes favorable again, they can sort of reactivate and come back to life, so to speak. Not to say that they ever died, but they just sort of halt their development and growth, and resume where they left off when the temperatures dropped really low. So I don't know, here I am. I'm a little distracted, so I'm sort of picking worms out one by one, which isn't really what I was after here today. I was really hoping to cash in on some nice sections where there's good amounts of worms. And I just happened to stumble on one as I was about to say that, which is kind of cool. So we'll see about collecting just a little bit more. Usually I top off this plastic container. Oh, let's get this little guy back in here. And it does seem like this is something I could spend all day doing, because it is kind of interesting. Not only collecting all these worms and you know, marveling at the number of them in here. And I should also mention, for those of you that are not aware, these worms were never placed in here. I never stocked this container with compost worms. All I ever did was place materials in here that needed to be composted, and all the inhabitants of this container all voluntarily made their way into here. So, you know, I myself am pretty fascinated by the fact that all these worms just came up out of the soil and made their way into here. And, you know, naturally over years they've just been born here. There's been generations and generations of them born in here. But, you know, it had to start somewhere. So it was kind of cool that composting worms were able to find their way into my compost barrel and stake it out as their property, and, you know, raise numerous generations in here since then. And, you know, on a kind of a non-stop basis, always be there for me to help break down my scraps. So look at that, I'm only halfway full. Jeez Louise. I'm getting a little bit tired, hunched over this barrel here, picking out worms. But, you know, I mean, I'm almost feeling like I don't have to go too crazy collecting worms here, because I do feel like we already started out our bag with a huge number of worms that were, you know, scattered throughout that material that I had sifted out and screened when I had harvested the old previous version of the barrel, or the previous version of the outdoor worm bag. So, you know, I'm not even sure. I'd love to hear people's thoughts on what they thought they saw there. I know that that's not a very scientific way to estimate the number of worms there are, but there's no other way other than guessing based on observation, because I have no other way to determine how many worms I've got in that system. But I do like to start my systems out with some sort of a rough estimate, and I always do put a lot of, you know, weight on the input I get from the viewers, because a lot of viewers like to, you know, kick in their thoughts on what they think they saw there in terms of number of worms collected. And then I'll usually record the number as some sort of an average between, you know, what I thought I saw and what the viewers thought they saw. This is a black soldier fly. I kind of feel bad because I'm, you know, picking around through here, and hopefully, you know, the worms can handle it. But if there's a fly trying to, you know, walk out of the system and get airborne and exit the system, poor little guy is getting buried. Like that little guy I just tried pulling off the wall. I was gonna see if I can just get him up a little higher and get him out of harm's way to make sure I'm not gonna hurt the little guy, and then I accidentally just knocked him down into the material. But that's kind of cool. Almost every time I come over here I always find one or two black soldier flies that have just recently emerged out of their see, right there's another one, and they're so docile. You know, if you find one of these little guys, they've got no stinger. They don't even have any mouth parts for that matter. I believe they have the means to drink water somehow or absorb moisture to stay alive, but their only job is to reproduce, and then they die. So they don't even eat in the adult fly form, but they sure eat when they're still all right, let's let this little guy off. Get him off onto the edge of the barrel. Oh, he just fell back in. Sorry, buddy. I don't know, maybe oops, whatever, I dropped him. I always wonder, you know, do they meet right here? Do the black soldier flies just kind of hook up right here on the edge of my container and then mate and drop their eggs right back down into the container? It does seem like a sensible thing for them to do, knowing that that's just where they came from, and that it's a place where there's plenty of nourishment and food for their next generation. So it's kind of the way I'm guessing it works. There's all kinds of stuff in here. I think that was avocado pit breaking apart pretty readily in my hands. And, you know, like I said earlier, it seems like I could just go through this stuff, you know, on and on, keep picking out worms, but I think we're gonna end it at this. We're gonna just pull out one or two more worms, start stacking all the material that we pulled out back into here, and let the entire process continue, and then we're gonna release the collected worms into our new outdoor worm bag. Oh, it's so heavy. I'm gonna take this stuff first, drop it in low,
save all the larger leafy stuff that I pulled out in the beginning to cover up with. There's all kinds of good yummy stuff in here, and I don't mind certain things being in here, but I'd also prefer to keep other certain things out, you know. I don't want to have raccoons coming in here making a meal out of it and picking stuff out and tossing stuff around, or whatever other kind of creatures roam around in my yard here. So I do like to keep things somewhat covered up, and that's the part of the reason I like to have all the weeds that I pluck out and all the garden trimmings scattered across the top, because it kind of creates a little bit of a barrier, and it prevents any sort of you know, curious creatures from wanting to roam around looking for stuff in this bin. Gosh almighty, there's so much background noise, you know. I took a pause before because there was landscaping crew cutting hedges across the way with a couple gas-powered hedge trimmers. Then there was another landscaper working in the other direction using their blower to, you know, push all the clippings around with the air, and there's a lot of noise pollution going on out here. So I think it's on to the grand finale of releasing the worms we collected, and now we've got ourselves a brand new outdoor worm bin. So now all we're left with now is just the release of the worms that we just collected. So yeah, that was really cool, you know. I was so glad to see that we had so many worms hanging out of that material that I had from the old version of this bag. So I don't even know how many worms are in here already from that first batch of stuff that we threw in here, and then I don't even know how many we've got in here, but I've got kind of a rough number in my head, you know. So I'm not even going to reveal it. I'm not even going to say how many worms I think we've got here to start this bin with today. But I'd love to hear your thoughts, you know. Please let me know in a comment what you think we've got as far as the worms that we saw earlier getting placed in here, as well as the worms that we just collected out of my compost barrel, as far as just like the original starting quantity of worms with which we're launching this bin here today. So let's get these little guys situated in their new home, and then we'll be all set to go. We'll be done. So I don't see any worms sticking to the container, which is cool. So there we go. I can see a black soldier fly larvae right there, and some sort of a seed that's sprouting here. There's always all kinds of crazy stuff going on in a compost barrel. But you can see we've got ourselves a pretty good turnout of worms nestled within this material here. I'm assuming that the material that I'm bringing over here, all this stuff right here, is pretty much, you know, a combination of not only castings and frass, a mix of their poop, worm and insect poop, but it's also chunks of food. You know, there's all kinds of chunks of food here that they can continue feeding on. You know, all the bedding that the bin is made up out of is food as well, not to mention all the recycled materials that came out of the old setup of this bin, all that coarse material that did not pass through the screen. All of that stuff is all food as well. So I don't really feel a dire need to give this system any food, not for a while at least. But we might check in here at some point soon just to see how things are progressing, make sure everything looks good. So yeah, I'm curious to see if people think, number one, should I have added water to this system? Is it too dry? Should I dump in some water, or should I just let it be, and then the rain and whatnot will over time dampen the contents? And secondly, how many worms do you think we're launching this system with? I really look forward to reading everyone's comments. But that's it. Please help me welcome my newest system, my new version 3.0 outdoor worm bag. And that's the end of the video. So I've got a few more things to take care of, stuff to put away, things to clean up, but I'm not going to bore you with that. Before I go though, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching.